And then the next panel discussion will be, discussants will be a duo, right? We're going to get tag teamed. And that's Sarita Amrute, and she is an anthropologist who works on race and labor and transnational coding economics. Her book is Encoding Race, Encoding Class, Indian IT Workers in Berlin, and this will be published by Duke University Press. And then we have Leilani Nishime, and she's an associate professor of communication. She researches Asian American mainstream and alternative media. And she's the author of Undercover Asian, Multiracial Asian Americans in Visual Culture, and the editor of East Main Street, Asian American Popular Culture. And their talk will be called, is titled, Beyond the Model Minority Myth and Grounds for Collective Action.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. We both want to say thank you first to Stephanie for organizing and Waidia for leading our panel and everyone else behind the scenes who organized. I also wanted to just say that basically everything I have to say today I've learned from listening really carefully to agitators and organizers. Especially I wanted to shout out the Garfield Black Student Union, from whom I learned so much. Unbelievable. And Aretha Basu, who I hope is still here. I heard her talk last night, and it was just so, thank you, Aretha, awesome talk. So I have to give credit to Aretha, because a lot of what I'm saying is really stuff that she's already said much more eloquently. Okay, let's take it away, and we're going to dialogue and riff a little bit, so.
All right. So we wanted to talk about the title of the panel was about thinking about alliances and thinking about a universal call for social justice. And so we were trying to think about how do we understand this universal call and still remain centered on Blackness and still remain centered on thinking about anti-Black racism. So one of the ways that we wanted to bring this in was from our own specific understanding, which is through an Asian American lens, and thinking about the ways that we are racialized as Asian Americans, and we're racialized as Asian Americans into a system that supports anti-Black racism. That part of what makes us Asian Americans in this country is the way that there is also this racial hierarchy that becomes naturalized through thinking about how Asian Americans are used. And so one of the primary ways this happens is through this model minority myth.
Yeah, so this slide I really just pulled off of a Google search for model minority, and it's kind of brilliant. It shows Indians, Chinese people, Vietnamese, Japanese people, and so on, as this group of highly successful, obviously college-educated people who can serve as a foil, as an opposition to Black Americans. And we're going to show you a clip. I'm sorry for this, but we're going to show you a clip from Bill O'Reilly in which he very effectively pits Asian Americans, and really it's more than just Asian Americans, it's really diasporic Asian people who are now so tightly linked with global economies against the quote-unquote failing African American population.
Don't worry, we're not going to make you listen to the whole thing.
Last summer, in fact, Kelly and I debated the concept of white privilege, whereby some believe that if you are Caucasian, you have inherited advantages in America. Talking Points does not believe in white privilege.
Just in case you were wondering.
There is no question that African Americans have a much harder time succeeding in our society than whites do. But the primary reason is not skin color, it's education, not only book learning. Here are the facts. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate for Black Americans is 11.4%. It's just over 5% for whites, 4.5% for Asians. So, do we have Asian privilege in America? The truth is, of Asian children living in single-parent homes, compared to a whopping 55% for blacks.
Yeah, I think we've got it. Yeah.
So there you go.
So let's cut him off, right?
Yeah.
So it's like he took an ethnic studies class, and he's checking off every single box of every single offensive stereotype I think he can find out there. But I think what is amazing about this short clip is the way he really does touch on every single aspect of the model minority stereotype about family unity, about wealth, about education. And he uses it in a way that bludgeons African Americans, right? He uses it as a way to justify inequality in the US.
And to my mind, the other thing that he's doing so horribly skillfully here is just shifting the discourse. So we can stop talking about Black Lives Mattering, about violence against people of color, about intersections among violence against Black men and violence against Muslim men, for instance, and start talking about what unfair advantages Asians have and why they have it so good. So he therefore moves us away from articulations and expressions of solidarity and starts to try to pit various groups of people of color against one another.
And I think one of the significant things to think about with this clip is that it's coming in the heels. There was just a study that came out a few months ago that looked at 160 episodes of Sunday news television across the spectrum. And it found in those 160 shows there were 13 mentions of Asian Americans. 11 of them were in a list: Asian American, African American, Native American, blah, blah, blah. So there were 2 mentions of Asian Americans in 160 shows, adding up to 73 words. So if you think about the very few times you actually see Asian Americans on TV, you'll hear about Asian Americans in the news, they're being used to promote anti-Black racism, right? That's one of the very few times they actually get mobilized in the US as a object for discussion.
Which should tell you that we don't really see very much about the lives of Asian Americans in our news media or in the media in general at all. And that the picture is much more varied and complex than that.
But I think one of the other things that's going on with this kind of comparison that I think gets masked a bit is the way that this comparison also creates equivalencies, or tries to create equivalencies between African Americans and Asian Americans. So as an example, I want to show a flip side of this. This was an article that came out in Time magazine about why Asian Americans should care about Ferguson. And this is coming from, I think you'd say like a leftist perspective, someone who you might think of as an ally, but this was a very problematic essay. And the majority of the essay is about the reasons that Asian Americans should care about Ferguson is because Asian Americans are also targeted by the police. And so what it tries to do is create this kind of equivalence, say, the only reason we would care is because we're also becoming targets, rather than really understanding this within a different kind of context, within, as we've been hearing all morning long, all day long, about the ways there's a specific kind of targeting of African Americans that's going on in this country. By creating these kinds of equivalences, again, you're shifting the conversation so that the conversation is no longer about African Americans and no longer about anti-Black racism. So you see the same thing going on with that O'Reilly part too, though. So what he's arguing is that Asian Americans and African Americans are the same. And because they're the same, how can we understand Asian American success? Well, it must be some sort of cultural difference. When we actually have extremely different kinds of histories, and we're positioned extremely differently in this country, and that's why there's these kinds of disparities.
And I wanted to say another word on the equivalence piece. The other problem with it, of course, as was echoed in the morning sessions, is that it treats humans within juridical quality, within the juridical category of being equal participants as citizens. But when in fact we know very clearly that in practice disparities are produced through the very mechanism of the law. So it takes what should be something that we fight for and assumes it, and therefore erases actually existing differences in practice. I don't think. Okay, we're going to say a very quick thing about history, simply because our panelists from this morning are actually experts in these topics, and I wanted to point specifically to the Moon's work, Scott's work, and Stephanie's work on the long history of slavery, indenture, and the history of Black Asian coalition building in Los Angeles in Scott's work. But one thing that I wanted to say here is that in addition to centering the lives of Black people and forms of oppression, to my mind, it's very, very important to revive and resuscitate histories of interconnection. So one way to do it is to think about the history, the longue durée history of empire. And one thing that's clear is that the end of slavery formally also meant the beginning of indentured servitude for people around the globe, because in fact, populations were needed to work on plantations. And so in fact, it's only because colonial powers had figured out that they could draw on Chinese and Indian laborers to populate plantation economies that slavery was in fact abolished in the British Empire. So there are these articulations. It's a difference between saying two populations are equivalent and one is doing well whereas the other isn't, and recognizing common ground from which we can draw strategies and techniques of organizing, right? So these images just simply show a cane worker in the fields in Fiji. And then do you want to say a few words about the image?
The other image is from the late 1800s, when there was a lot of concern that if Asian Americans and African Americans could recognize their similarities, could recognize ways that they might be united in labor struggles, that it caused a great deal of anxiety. So this was a cartoon that was, if you could see a little bit clearer, they're images of the Chinese worker and the African American worker. This is we're both migrating for labor. They're very parallel images, right? So the fear, and they're both grotesque images. And the fear was that these two populations, that if they became united, would create this kind of terrorizing threat to the social order, which I think is what we want to mobilize at this point, right?
Agitators. And I just wanted to mention some other historical articulations. This is the cover image of a book that recently came out by Vivek Bald called Bengali Harlem and the Lost Histories of South Asian America, in which he traces immigrants from Bengal living in Harlem, but also in the American South, who created all sorts of allegiances with local populations, sometimes because they were all Muslims. And he says these are lost histories, and it's true, largely because people's names got changed in ways that became really unrecognizable, or they were from weaving communities and they were practicing this weaving called chicken, and it gets changed phonetically. So there is a long history to be recuperated and to be remembered, even as we are saddened by the fact that we have to keep repeating Black Lives Matter. I think it's also a moment in which we can celebrate and recover these histories of solidarity that otherwise simply get pushed out of the frame.
And I think another.
Slide, please.
Thank you. And these aren't all just things that are stuck in the past. I think there's many ways that this argument that Asian Americans and African Americans are oppositional, that there's nothing that connects them together, is one that's still being perpetuated in the media. So you could see this headline: Ferguson's other race problem, riots damage Asian-owned stores, right? So you see a title like that, you see a headline like that. I think we all know what story this is going to tell. This is a story that you hear over and over again, right? That there's this kind of instinctive animosity between these two groups. Can you go to the next slide? And you see the pullout quote here as well. Hopefully it won't devolve into what happened in the LA riots, Wang said, because if it happens, we're all getting out of Dodge, right? So that's the pull quote, that's the title you get there. If you actually read the article, this is right besides that pull quote. It says, there's no similarity in the tension in Ferguson. Look, say in fact some 40 residents of the suburb formed a picket line at the Ferguson market last Friday in an unsuccessful attempt to protect it from looting. And many have offered to help clean up in the aftermath of violence. Quote, we support this community and this community supports us. So this is from the actual store owner, the Indian American store owner, who's saying, we are part of this community. We don't feel this tension that you're reporting right next to us in this pull quote, right? That there's actually, the article itself is telling a completely different story than the one that we're getting in the headlines. So I think what I want to emphasize here is the way that that same story is our dominant narrative, and that we need to find other kinds of narratives, right? We need to find other ways to tell that story.
Okay, so now we're gonna just quickly show you some of the great other alternative narratives that are out there. So I am not inventing them, I'm not that smart, but there are people on the ground who are doing this all the time, and I'm really overjoyed to see it happening in front of my eyes. So one is this hashtag called Model Minority Mutiny, and the image I'm showing here, I don't know if it's clear, is a woman, yeah, it's really dark, holding up a sign that says Model Minority Mutiny. And if you follow this hashtag on Twitter, it's just a lot of people trying to dismantle this myth of the model minority and actually reject it. So rather than claiming it as a way to move up within a certain structurally racist organization of power, they actually throw it off. And so I think this is one really good way of being an ally, of standing with, rather than in standing in for or speaking for, or something along those lines.
And so there's a couple more pictures. This is from the Oakland takeover of the police department. It was spearheaded by a Black Lives Matters group, but it was supported by Asian for Black Lives, and they promoted it as a solidarity movement, and their hashtag for this was, "This is what solidarity looks like." The other image, which is also quite dark, I'm sorry for this, if you could see it, was the end of the march in DC, and this is on Monday, which ended at Chinatown and ended in a die-in in front of Chinatown, which was also a coalitional building moment.
Okay, again, a sign from a rally, standing with, right? I think the language of standing with really speaks to the way in which articulations and solidarity building can happen among community members. And then finally, I wanted to talk about this slide on the left. It says Delhi stands with Ferguson, and here I think we can start thinking in really interesting ways globally about different sorts of protest movements and how they might articulate together. So these are students at JNU, which is in New Delhi, a university in New Delhi, responding to Ferguson, but there has been a history of protests in Delhi after the rape and murder of a student there last year by a bus driver, and much of the organization in those protests has precisely been against police brutality. Because police are often complicit in violence against women in India. So one other sort of intersection that we can think of here is what is the global face of police brutality, if that's one of the moments that we're tracing here. And then as the morning session reflected, how do we want to think about the criminalization of certain populations across the globe in response to American global power, but also in terms of fighting against that. So what intersections can we build around that as well? You want to talk about the Hong Kong?
Yeah. So I don't actually have much to add, but the other image is from the recent student movements in Hong Kong. If you Google Hands Up Hong Kong, you'll find hundreds of these images where you see thousands of protesters who are getting inspiration from Ferguson and quoting Ferguson physically by using the hands up symbols.
That's it, we're done.